Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chafei, Volume 25, the Sicha for Asara B'Teves, the fast of 10th of Teves. This is a short but very powerful Sicha which explains how Asara B'Teves, although on the surface it seems to be the worst of all the fasts, yet it carries innately a actual and most positive message possible. As a quick introduction, the four major fasts, the Arba Tzoymis, which is the 10th of Teves, the 17th of Tammuz, in which the walls of Yerushalayim were breached, Tisha B'Av, of course, the 9th of Av, when both of the Batei Mikdashes, both temples were destroyed, and Tzom Gedalia, on which Gedalia was killed. We commemorated on the 3rd of Tishrei, which is the day after Rosh Hashanah. Some argue that it actually happened on Rosh Hashanah, but either way, this was a terrible calamity as this culminated and fully, so to speak, the last nail in the coffin of the destruction. Because what happened was, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Nebuchadnezzar allowed for a remnant of Jews to remain in Yerushalayim with the appointed governor, Gedalia, who was his representative. And when Gedalia was killed, now all the Jews had to flee Yerushalayim, and unfortunately this was the final blow of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and the exile. Another thing to be familiar with, Yerushalayim. What is the significance of Yerushalayim? What does it mean, Yerushalayim? We all know it's a very special city. Well, number one, Yerushalayim, as Tosfos explains in Maseches Tainis, that Yerushalayim is actually a combination of two words, Yira or Yirei Shalem, that this is the full and complete fear, meaning that Yerushalayim, by virtue of its holiness, especially when people came and experienced the Beis HaMikdash and all that went on there, they actually saw godliness. This would leave a lasting impression on them and totally permeate them with the fear, the awe, and respect for Hashem. Even months later, while they were already back home, it still had a lingering effect. Another thing about Yerushalayim, as it says in Tehillim, in chapter 122, Kapitel Kuchafez, Ir Shechubra Layachtav. This is a city which knit or bound them together, meaning that the city Yerushalayim, by virtue of its existence and whom it belonged to, always united all the Jews. You see, Yerushalayim was never divided amongst the Shvatim, although it is present in the geographical territory of Shevet Yehuda and Shevet Binyamin, but yet the actual ownership of Yerushalayim does not belong exclusively to any particular Shevet, any particular tribe, rather to all the Jewish people. Furthermore, when everyone ascended to Yerushalayim, when everyone came to Yerushalayim for the Aliyah L'Regel, the 3 times a year pilgrimage, all Jews were united. There was no difference between one Jew or one tribe or another. Everyone ascended in Yerushalayim together and equally. So Yerushalayim represents fear of Hashem and unity of the Jewish people. And last thing to be familiar with, the idea of Yom Kippur. The concept of Yom Kippur, we know Yom Kippur is the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. In fact, the Torah refers to the Yom Kippur when it discusses the Avodah, the service of Yom Kippur and the laws of Yom Kippur. It says Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh, which literally translates in the midst of this day. However, the word etzem also means in the essence, that Yom Kippur represents the highest level of the essence of holiness. In fact, in reference to Yom Kippur, the Torah says that it is a day of Shabbos Shabbosain, which means a double Shabbos, which tells us that it's even greater than Shabbos, and this explains why when Yom Kippur falls out on Shabbos, although you're typically not allowed to fast on Shabbos, but not only you're allowed to fast, but it is a mitzvah to fast. It overrides Shabbos. So let's get into the actual Sicha. Describing the fast of Asara B'Teves, the Rambam says, Boy Somach Melech Bovel Yerushalayim. This is the day when the king, the Babylonian king, Somach, literally means he leaned on, he pressed on Yerushalayim, and he brought it under siege. Now, this set into motion, of course, all the other sad events that followed later, 17th of Tammuz, Tisha B'Av, and Tzom Gedalia. And this explains the fact that Asara B'Teves was the opening, was the catalyst for all the other terrible events that followed. This explains something interesting that the Avrohom points out, that he says the fast of the 10th of Teves is so severe that if it were to fall out on Shabbos, then you would have to fast on Shabbos. I mean, in fact, it can never fall out on Shabbos. The way our calendar is set up, the way the formula of our calendar is set up, it can never ever fall out on Shabbos. But technically speaking, if it were to fall out on Shabbos, you would have to fast. Why is that? Because in Yecheskel, in the prophet Ezekiel, where it describes the events of Asara B'Teves, it says, "Be'etzem hayom hazeh samach melech Bavel." In the midst of this very day, using the same expression as we said in the introduction that is used in reference to Yom Kippur. So it tells us just like Yom Kippur overrides Shabbos, the fast of Yom Kippur, so too Tisha B'Av technically would override Shabbos. And as we said, the reason for it is because this is the root, this is the source for all of the Goliaths, all the exiles that were in. Not only the first Beis HaMikdash, but being that the second Beis HaMikdash, the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, is really all a continuum and a derivative of the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, therefore it follows that Asara B'Teves, the 10th of Teves, is like the master source for all of the Golas. And that's why it's so severe. Now, we have a rule, the Torah tells us, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu maktim refuah l'maka, that whenever there is an affliction, whenever there is an illness, whatever it may be, Hashem always prefaces the appearance of the makkah with the healing agent, with the remedy, with the solution. That means even prior to the makkah coming out to start to prevail, already there is the remedy that's sitting in wait. Now, what does this mean, says the Rebbe? This doesn't only mean that after you have the makkah, then you realize that there's a remedy. But rather it means that it's in such a way, as we'll see soon in the Sikha, that melechatchila, there is no problem. Hashem makes it so that if we were only to tap into the refuah that's already there, it not that it undoes the makkah later. Not only that it's there to undo, so to speak, and remedy the problem that already exists, but rather it has the potential of making it so that the problem shouldn't even occur, shouldn't even come into existence. So from this it comes out, in regards to our problem here that we're discussing, Asara B'Teves, that even before Samach Melech Bavel, already there was a refuah. Even before there was the siege of Yerushalayim, there was already a remedy for it, in a manner that if we would only have tapped into it properly, there would have never been a real siege, and there would have never been a gullus. What is this all about? So the Chazal tell us that what is really the reason for the Churban of the Beis HaMikdash? So in reference to the second Beis HaMikdash, we know clearly that it was because of baseless hatred. Sinas Chinam. And this tells us that what is the obvious remedy to that? What is the solution to that? How do you fix that problem? By Ahavas Chinon, by having baseless love for one another. Ahavas Yisrael, which leads ultimately, what is the true sign? The true, so to speak, an absolute, clear sign that you have true Ahavas Yisrael when there is unity, when there is Achdus Yisrael. And this is not only in regards to the second Beis HaMikdash, but really we can say this is also at the core, this was the reason for the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. In other words, it all boils down to the lack of unity amongst Jews, and therefore the lack of love amongst Jews. How do we say this? Although the Chazal tell us that explicitly, the reasons for the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash was because of the three cardinal sins, Avodah Zarah, Gil Harayos, Shvichas Damim, which is idolatry, adultery, and murder, homicide. Still, we know that the Chazal tell us elsewhere that even when God forbid, if all Jews were to worship idols, to do the worst of sins, but if there was unity amongst them, then no one can touch them. They're untouchable. So that tells us that the fact that we became touchable, the fact that these sins prevailed and allowed for the enemy to come in and, God forbid, affect us and have the effect that they had, tells us that there was a lack of unity. So it all comes back to that there was a deficiency in Ahavas Yisrael, in the love of one Jew to another. So this, from all this comes out that if we say that the remedy is not only there available to correct the problem that came, but is already there within and even before the makkah appears, so to speak, on the scene, this tells us that already from the very beginning, even before or while the king of Babel was initiating the siege, already there was the refuah, already there was the remedy of peace and unity, harmony and unity. What does this mean? How do you see it? Where do we see it in the actual siege? It says the Rebbe, take a look. What is the idea of a siege? What is the definition of a siege? Literally, it means that no one can leave the city. Ein yoytze ve'ein ba. No one can leave the city, and no foreigner can enter the city. In other words, the people are there in the city. In this case, which was Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim became, in the literal sense, Ir Shechur Lo Yachtov, a city which united everyone there. Every single yid in that city was united. They couldn't go, they couldn't leave, they couldn't ununite themselves, so to speak. They couldn't dislodge themselves. There was nowhere to go, and there was no foreigner coming to join them. So therefore, it was only Yidden. And where? In which city? In the city of Yerushalayim. The city, like we said in the introduction, which epitomizes and represents the idea of fear of Hashem. Yerushalayim is Yirei Shalem, in a place where everybody was inspired by Yerushalayim, by the greatness of what took place there. And so much that it would last them for months after they already came back home. So this, of course, leads to the fact that there is unity coupled with Yirei Shamayim. From here we see how from the very beginning of the Golus, meaning already in the stage of the beginning of the emergence of the Makkah, of the affliction, already there is built in the remedy of the solution. As the siege was being laid, and they were now becoming tight, unified together, albeit not by their own choice. Okay? This is not by their own choice. But they were already in a state of unity in Yerushalayim. Moreover, think about it this way. Even before the full emergence of the severity of this siege, of this makkah, of this affliction, the refuah, the remedy agent, as we said, the idea of unity and peace was already there in full swing and full force. Why? Because it takes time until the effects of a siege are really felt. It takes time until you start feeling a shortage of supplies, a shortage of food, a shortage of freedom, and so on and so forth. The first while it doesn't really have such a severe, brutal effect. But the effect of the unity was already there. So the refuah was already in full force even before the makkah was totally effective. And according to this, we have a better appreciation of the wording, the expression that's used. Samach melech Bavel. What does it mean he leaned to lay a siege, that he leaned on Yerushalayim? The idea of samach, you can say, also comes from the etymology of the word smicha, which means to support, to help. That in the actual makkah, in the affliction itself, there's already the refuah, there's already the smicha, there's already the support for the remedy, and the remedy is actually there. And the fact that, moreover, that it wasn't done by their own choice. Who forced them into this? In other words, Samach Melech Bavel, the king Nebuchadnezzar is who forced them into this. Forced Yidden, the one who seems to have forced them into something bad, actually in the initial stage was the full-fledged emergence of the refuah, of the remedy agent aspect of it, which is forced upon them, even if they weren't fully ready for it, but it was forced upon them ever before the makkah fully set in. The makkah aspect of it fully set in. And that is that the achdus, and like we said, which achdus? The unity of theirs. And where? In Yerushalayim was already set in by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, ultimately, the purpose of all the 4 fasts, like the Rambam writes, is la'oiden halavavis, to arouse the hearts, to arouse us, and to trigger liftoyach darchei tshuva, to trigger the ways of tshuva. How? By remembering all the terrible calamities and what caused them, what brought them about. This triggers that we should do tshuva. From this it's understood that when it comes to Asara B'Teves, the first and foremost, we must remember what is the way to undo all these tzaras, what is the way to undo all these calamities? Through Avos Yisrael, to love of other Jews, to Achdus Yisrael, to unity with each and every Yid. That Pashut Yidden have to forge together with what? with the idea of Yerushalayim, through Yiddishkeit, through Yerushalayim, through the idea of the Beis HaMikdash. And then, of course, all the fasts will be void. Not only will they be void, but as the Chazal tell us, as it says, that Yehafchu Yomim Elu, the Moedim Ul Yomim Tevim, that these days will actually convert, they will transform. Not only they no longer will be sad days, but they'll become days of joy. Now, since we know that the Yerida, the descent, the breakage, so to speak, of Asara B'Teves, as we said, is worse than all the other fasts, in the sense that it was the master source for all of them. So it's understood, we know that the Yerida is Tzorech Aliyah. Whenever there's a descent, it's for the purpose of the ascent, so that you gain afterwards. So if the Yerida was so severe, then the Aliyah would be even greater, and we're going to come to the level by transforming Asara B'Teves. Not only it should no longer be a sad day, but it should become a day of joy, that it will transform into the aspect of Yom Kippur, which is Be'etzem HaYom Hazeh, as it's mentioned, the same expression is mentioned by Asara B'Teves and Yom Kippur, that it will come to Yom Kippur, which is even greater than Shabbos itself, as we said, Shabbos Shabbosin.